The slap came before the words did. My father's hand connected with my cheek so hard that I tasted copper before I understood what had happened. The living room tilted. My mother's teacup rattled against its saucer. My brother didn't look up from his phone. "You embarrassed me," my father said, his voice low and controlled in that way that meant he was angrier than if he'd shouted. In front of the entire congregation. I was still processing the pain radiating from my jaw when he grabbed a fistful of my hair at the crown of my head. The roots screamed. He dragged me 3 steps toward the front door before my mother's voice cut through. "David, not where the neighbors can see. Not asterisk don't star. Just asterisk not where they can see star." He released me. I crumpled against the wall, my scalp burning, my vision swimming with tears I refused to let fall. Through the blur, I watched him smooth his shirt, adjust his watch, reset himself into the composed man everyone at church thought he was. My name is Maya Chen, and I was 23 years old the day I learned that invisible violence is still violence, and that family can be the cruelest kind of trap. I had a degree in social work that I'd earned while living in this house, walking on eggshells, performing the role of dutiful daughter. I had exactly $1,847 in my bank account, a car that needed new brakes, and a job offer 3 states away that I'd been too afraid to accept. Until that moment, I'd told myself I stayed because my mother needed me. Because my younger brother Joshua needed someone who saw him. Because leaving would make me selfish, ungrateful, weak. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I stayed because I didn't know how to be the daughter who walked away. "What you said to Pastor Jim," my father continued, pacing now, his hands clasped behind his back like he was delivering a sermon, "about questioning traditional gender roles in leadership. Do you have any idea how that reflects on me? In this family?" I had asked a question during Bible study. One question. About why women couldn't serve as deacons in our church when they comprised 70% of the volunteers who actually kept the place running. I'd been polite. I'd been respectful. I'd used scripture to support my point. Pastor Jim had smiled his thin smile and said, "That's an interesting perspective, Maya, but I think you're confused about the nature of biblical authority." My father had gone rigid in his seat. Now, 4 hours later, my cheek was swelling and my scalp was on fire, and my mother was in the kitchen pretending nothing had happened, running water for dinner dishes that weren't dirty yet. "I was just asking," I started. "You were showing off," he interrupted. "Trying to prove you're smarter than everyone else because you went to college. Well, your college professors filled your head with liberal nonsense, and I won't have you spreading it in my church. Asterisk my church star. Not God's church. Not our church." "Hi." Joshua finally looked up from his phone. He was 19, still living at home while he figured things out, which mostly meant playing video games and working part-time at Best Buy. Our eyes met for half a second. I saw something flicker there, discomfort, maybe, or recognition. But then he looked away, and I understood that he wouldn't help me. He never did. Staying invisible kept him safe. I'd perfected that same survival strategy for years. "Go to your room," my father said, dismissing me like I was 12 instead of 23. "We'll discuss your apology tomorrow." I didn't move. "Maya." His voice dropped into warning territory. "I'm not apologizing," I heard myself say. The words came from somewhere deep and previously untapped, some reserve of dignity I didn't know I still had. I didn't do anything wrong. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My father took 1 step toward me. That was all it took for my body to betray me, flinching backward, shoulders curling inward, making myself smaller. The instinct was automatic. Practiced. He saw it. He always saw it. And I watched satisfaction settle into the corners of his mouth. "You're living under my roof," he said softly, "eating my food, using my electricity, driving a car I helped you buy. You'll apologize, or you'll leave. Those are your options." I wanted to scream that I paid rent, that I bought my own groceries, that I'd been contributing to the household bills since I got my first job at 16. But the numbers didn't matter. The facts didn't matter. In my father's reality, his money was always bigger than mine, his authority always absolute. I went to my room. It was the same room I'd had since childhood, still painted the pale yellow my mother had chosen when I was 8, still decorated with the modest curtains and minimal furniture that matched the rest of the house's aesthetic of performance modesty. My bookshelf held the books my father approved of: Christian living, wholesome fiction, nothing too intellectual or challenging. My real books, the ones I'd accumulated in college, were in boxes under my bed. I sat on the edge of my mattress and pulled out my phone with shaking hands. The job offer was still in my email inbox. Director of Community Outreach at a non-profit in Portland. Good salary. Benefits. An apartment subsidy for the first 6 months. They'd sent it 3 weeks ago with a 2-week deadline that I'd asked to extend, claiming I needed time to sort out personal commitments. The hiring manager had been kind about it. Take the time you need, she'd written. But we'd really love to have you on the team. I opened a new tab and searched for flights to Portland. One way. Leaving tomorrow. $347. I could afford it. Just barely. My hands were still shaking, but something else was rising underneath the fear, something that felt like clarity, cold and clean. I'd been trained my whole life to believe that obedience was love, that submission was faith, that questioning anything made me rebellious and broken. My father wielded scripture like a weapon, selective in his interpretation, absolute in his authority. My mother enabled him through silence, through her endless capacity to look away. Joshua survived by becoming invisible. And I had survived by making myself small, by swallowing my thoughts, by apologizing for taking up space. But tonight, something had shifted. Maybe it was the force of the slap. Maybe it was the way my mother had worried about the neighbors instead of her daughter. Maybe it was seeing Joshua's eyes slide away from mine, choosing safety over solidarity. Or maybe I'd just finally reached the limit of what I could endure. I pulled my suitcase down from the closet and started packing. I moved quietly, methodically, choosing only what mattered. Clothes, documents, the hidden books, my laptop, the jewelry my grandmother had left me that my mother kept trying to claim for herself. I worked until midnight, until my room looked like an edited version of itself, stripped of personality but still passing inspection if anyone glanced in. At 2 a.m., I lay in bed, fully dressed, watching the hours count down on my phone. At 5 a.m., I heard my father's alarm go off. He kept a rigid schedule: up at 5, prayer and Bible reading until 6, breakfast at 6:30, out the door by 7:15. My mother woke at 5:30 to make his coffee exactly how he liked it. I waited until I heard his shower running. Then I carried my suitcase down the stairs, one careful step at a time, and loaded it into my car. The airport was 40 minutes away, but I drove to a grocery store parking lot instead and sat there until it opened at 6. I bought a coffee and a muffin I didn't eat and watched the sun come up through the windshield, my phone clutched in my lap, waiting for it to ring. It did, at 7:20. My father's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. Again, I didn't answer. The third time, I turned my phone off completely. I didn't want to hear his voice. I didn't want to give him the opportunity to talk me back into that house, into that life. Because he could. I knew he could. 23 years of conditioning doesn't evaporate just because you pack a suitcase. At 8, I turned my phone back on long enough to send one email. I accept the position. I can start Monday. Thank you for your patience. Then I bought the plane ticket. My phone erupted with notifications. 12 missed calls. 7 voicemails. Texts from my father, my mother, even Joshua. My father's messages were what I expected. Demands to come home immediately, accusations of selfishness and disrespect, Bible verses about honoring parents, threats about what would happen to my soul if I continued down this path of rebellion. My mother's were worse because they were gentler. Sweetie, please just come home. Your father is very upset. We can work this out. You're making this harder than it needs to be. As if I was the problem. As if I'd hit myself, dragged myself across the floor by my own hair. Joshua's message was a single sentence. Did you really leave? I almost responded to that one. Almost told him that yes, I really left, and that he could too, someday, if he got tired of disappearing into the furniture. But I didn't. He'd have to find his own breaking point. I turned my phone off again and drove to the airport. The flight was unremarkable. I sat in the middle seat between a businessman who ignored me and a college student who slept the entire way. I stared out the tiny window at the clouds and felt nothing. Numb. Empty. Like I'd used up all my adrenaline and fear, and what remained was just this hollow space where certainty used to be. What if I'd made a mistake? What if they were right and I was being selfish? What if I couldn't make it on my own and had to crawl back, proving everything my father had ever said about me? The thoughts circled like vultures, but I didn't have answers for them yet. Portland was grey and drizzling when I landed. I took a shuttle to a budget hotel near the non-profits office and checked in for 3 nights, which was all I could afford until my first paycheck. The room was small and smelled like industrial cleaner, but it was mine. No one could walk in without knocking. No one would tell me what to think or believe or say. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried for the first time since the slap. Not because I missed them. Because I didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I cried because I was free, and freedom was terrifying. On Monday, I showed up for my first day in the same blazer I'd worn to my interview 3 months ago and a smile I'd practiced in the hotel mirror. The non-profit operated out of a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that was gentrifying rapidly, serving a community that was being pushed out just as fast. My job was to bridge those gaps, connect long-time residents with resources, advocate for affordable housing, and coordinate with local leaders. It was meaningful work. Important work. The kind of thing I'd wanted to do since my first sociology class in college, when I realized that systems could be changed and that helping people meant more than just charity, it meant addressing root causes. My supervisor, Patricia, was a black woman in her 50s with grey locks and the kind of direct communication style that made my father's passive-aggressive control look even more cowardly in retrospect. "You'll do fine," she said after walking me through my first week's projects. "You've got good instincts. Just don't be afraid to speak up. We don't have time for people who stay quiet when they see problems." I nodded, uncertain if I was capable of being that person yet. The work consumed me, which was exactly what I needed. I spent my days meeting with community members, researching grant opportunities, building spreadsheets, and writing reports. I found an apartment, a studio above a Vietnamese restaurant, affordable only because the landlord was friends with Patricia and wanted to support the non-profit staff. It was tiny, barely 400 square feet, but it had good light and hardwood floors and a lock that only I had the key to. I bought a used futon, a desk from IKEA, and a lamp. I hung the curtains. I put my grandmother's jewelry in a small wooden box on the windowsill where the morning sun hit it. I built a life, piece by small piece. But I didn't turn my phone back on. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. I knew my family was trying to reach me. They had my email, and messages occasionally appeared in my spam folder, automatically filtered because I'd set up rules before I left. I didn't read them. I wasn't ready. Work became my anchor. Patricia introduced me to Maria, a community organizer who'd been fighting displacement in the neighborhood for 15 years. Maria was fierce and funny and didn't take shit from anyone. Not developers, not politicians, not the non-profit board when they suggested watering down her language in press releases. "You're good at this," Maria told me one afternoon as we walked back from a tenant meeting. "You listen. Really listen. People trust you." It was the first time in my life someone had complimented my work without attaching conditions to it. Without following it up with "but" or "however" or "you'd be even better if." I didn't know what to do with that kind of affirmation except hold it carefully, like something fragile. At night, in my tiny apartment, I read the books I'd hidden under my bed for years. I watched movies my father would have called worldly. I went to a yoga class and felt ridiculous but went back anyway. I had coffee with co-workers and learned how to make conversation that wasn't performative or defensive. I learned what it felt like to exist without constantly monitoring someone else's mood. But the guilt was always there, humming underneath everything like tinnitus. It whispered in my mother's voice. Asterisk, you abandoned your family. You broke your father's heart. You're selfish. Ungrateful. Rebellious. Asterisk. It whispered in scripture I'd memorized as a child, weaponized into chains. 2 months after I left, Patricia knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't read. "Do you have family in Colorado?" she asked. My stomach dropped. "Why?" "Someone claiming to be your father called the main office line. Said it was an emergency and he needed to reach you immediately." The room tilted slightly, the same way it had when his hand connected with my face. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Patricia said firmly. "I told him I couldn't confirm or deny anyone's employment without their written consent." He got aggressive, started quoting religious freedom laws and parental rights. I hung up on him. She paused, watching me carefully. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," she said. "But if you need support, a lawyer, a safety plan, anything, you tell me." "Okay." I nodded, not trusting my voice. After she left, I sat at my desk staring at my dark computer screen, seeing my own reflection instead. I looked different than I had 2 months ago. Thinner, maybe. Tired. But also somehow more solid, like I was taking up the space I actually occupied instead of trying to compress myself into something smaller and more acceptable. He'd found my workplace. Which meant he'd been looking. Which meant he wasn't going to just let me go. That night, I finally turned my phone back on. The voicemails had stopped after the first week, but the texts continued sporadically. My father's had evolved from angry to concerned to disappointed to frightening in their calculated calm. The most recent one, from 2 days ago: "Maya, this has gone on long enough. You're clearly not thinking straight. I've contacted some people who can help you. We all just want you to come home and get the support you need." The support I needed. Like I was sick. Like leaving was a symptom of illness rather than health. My mother's messages were a different kind of manipulation. "I miss you so much, sweetie. The house feels so empty without you. Your father has been so stressed. Please just call. We love you." Joshua had stopped texting after the first week. I scrolled through them all, my hands steady now, my breathing controlled. And then I did something I'd been avoiding because I knew once I started, I wouldn't be able to stop. I started researching. I typed my father's name into Google, and the first page of results was exactly what I expected. His church bio, his LinkedIn profile listing him as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm, and a few mentions in church newsletters. David Chen, devoted husband and father, faithful servant, pillar of the community. But I didn't stop at the first page. I added search terms: David Chen plus complaints, David Chen plus investigation, David Chen plus firm name. I searched for his professional license number, his business registrations, and his social media presence. On page 3 of Google results, I found something. A thread on a local forum from 18 months ago, quickly deleted but preserved in a cached version. Someone asking if anyone else had experienced unprofessional behavior from an accountant named David Chen. The replies were vague, carefully worded, probably written by people afraid of defamation lawsuits. But the pattern was there: mentions of aggressive communication, refusal to admit mistakes, threatening language when clients questioned his work. One person had written, "He told me I was rebellious and unteachable when I asked about a discrepancy in my tax return. What accountant talks like that?" The same words. The same framework. Control disguised as spiritual authority. I kept digging. I requested my own credit report and found something that made my blood run cold. 3 credit cards I'd never opened, all in my name, all opened when I was 18 and 19, all maxed out and sent to collections. The addresses on file were my parents' house. The contact phone number was my father's cell. He'd stolen my identity, destroyed my credit. And I'd never known because I'd been too afraid to check, too conditioned to trust that he had my best interests at heart. I sat at my IKEA desk in my tiny apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger yet. Something colder. More clarifying. Calculation. I started building a folder on my laptop. Screenshots of the credit report. Copies of the forum posts. I created a timeline, documenting everything I could remember. The financial control, the emotional manipulation, the physical violence. I wrote it all down in clear, unemotional language, the way I'd learned to write case notes in social work school. Then I researched Colorado consumer protection laws, identity theft statutes, mandatory reporting requirements for financial professionals. My father was a licensed CPA, which meant he was subject to professional ethics standards, which meant there were organizations that cared very much if he was engaging in fraud, even against his own daughter. I worked until 3 in the morning, and when I finally closed my laptop, I felt calm. Purposeful. The next morning, I called Patricia into my office and told her everything. Not because I needed her permission, but because she'd offered support and I'd learned enough in 2 months to know that accepting help wasn't a weakness. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each detail. "What do you want to do?" she asked when I finished. "I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else," I said. "And I want him to know that I'm not afraid of him anymore." Patricia nodded slowly. "I know a lawyer. She does pro bono work for domestic violence survivors. This qualifies. Financial abuse is domestic violence. I'll send you her contact information." "I can't afford." "Pro bono means free, Maya. And you're not alone in this. You understand?" I did. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to have people in my corner who didn't require me to shrink or apologize or perform gratitude. The lawyer's name was Jennifer Okafor, and she had the kind of calm, methodical energy that made me trust her immediately. We met at a coffee shop near her office, and I walked her through everything. The credit cards, the controlling behavior, the physical violence, the professional misconduct I'd found. She took notes on a legal pad, her handwriting neat and precise. "Here's what we're going to do," she said when I finished. "First, we filed a police report in Colorado for identity theft. Second, we dispute the fraudulent accounts and get them removed from your credit. Third, we file a complaint with the Colorado State Board of Accountancy regarding your father's professional conduct. The identity theft alone is grounds for license suspension, possibly revocation." "Will I have to see him?" I asked. "In court or?" "Not necessarily. Much of this can be handled remotely. And if he contests anything, we can request protective orders based on the history of abuse." She paused, studying me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Is any part of you doing this to punish him? Because if this is about revenge, it's going to eat you alive. But if this is about protecting yourself and holding him accountable, then we proceed." I thought about that for a long time. "Both," I finally said. "Is that okay?" Jennifer smiled slightly. "That's human. As long as the accountability part is primary, we're fine. The satisfaction is just a side benefit." We filed the police report remotely that afternoon. I gave my statement over the phone to a detective in Colorado who sounded bored until I mentioned that my father was a CPA who'd committed identity theft. Then his tone sharpened. "We'll need documentation," he said. "Credit reports, any communications that reference the accounts, timeline of events." I had it all ready. I'd been preparing for this conversation without realizing it, building my case in careful detail the same way my father had built his authority. Through documentation, through evidence, through the appearance of unassailable correctness. Except mine was actually true. The complaint to the State Board of Accountancy went out 2 days later. Jennifer helped me craft the language, keeping it factual and professional, citing specific ethical violations and attaching evidence. And then we waited. I went back to work. I met with community members and wrote grant proposals and attended tenant organizing meetings. I had dinner with Maria and her wife, sitting in their warm kitchen eating homemade tamales and laughing at stories about terrible landlords they'd fought over the years. I went to therapy for the first time in my life and cried in front of a kind woman named Dr. Patel who didn't quote scripture or tell me to honor my parents. "You're grieving," Dr. Patel said. "Not for who they were, but for who you needed them to be." That felt true in a way that hurt and healed simultaneously. 3 weeks after filing the complaint, I got a call from the detective in Colorado. "We've issued a warrant for your father's arrest," he said. "Identity theft, fraud, forgery. He'll be arraigned within 48 hours. You should know he's denying everything and claiming you're mentally unstable and making false accusations." I'd expected that. I'd practically written the script myself. Does he know where I am? I asked. No. And we've flagged your information as confidential in the system. He can't access it through the legal process. That night, I allowed myself to imagine it. My father being arrested at work, led out in handcuffs in front of his colleagues and clients. My father having to hire a lawyer, having to sit in a courtroom, having to answer for what he'd done. My father's carefully constructed image cracking open for everyone to see. The satisfaction was real, but it wasn't as overwhelming as I'd expected. Mostly, I just felt tired. And relieved. My mother called from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was brief and shaking. Maya, how could you do this to your father? To this family? After everything we've done for you. I don't even know who you are anymore. Good, I thought. Because I'm not who you tried to make me. Joshua sent a text from a new number too. Dad got arrested. Mom is losing it. Did you really call the cops on him? I stared at that message for a long time before responding. He committed multiple felonies and destroyed my credit. I reported a crime. That's not the same as calling the cops on him. He did this to himself. Joshua didn't respond. The State Board of Accountancy moved slower than the criminal case, but Jennifer assured me that was normal. Professional licensing boards are thorough, she said. They'll investigate, interview witnesses, and review his work history. This isn't going away. 2 months after I filed the complaint, my father's firm quietly let him go. I only knew because Maria found a local news article about the firm parting ways with senior accountant David Chen following allegations of professional misconduct. The article was carefully worded, legally protected, but it was there. Permanent. Searchable. His church stood by him, of course. I heard through someone who heard through someone that Pastor Jim had delivered a sermon about false accusations and the persecution of the faithful. Several church members had started a legal defense fund. But 3 families had quietly left the church. I knew because one of them reached out to me through LinkedIn, a woman my age whose father also served as a deacon. I always thought your family was perfect, she wrote. Thank you for showing me that I wasn't crazy for feeling uncomfortable. My dad isn't violent like yours, but the control. I understand now that it's not normal. I'm looking at apartments. I read that message 5 times, crying by the end. This was the part Jennifer had talked about. Not revenge. Accountability. And the ripple effects of someone finally saying